sitting with the discomfort implies sitting in reality, right? Because reality is uncomfortable. Not everybody's nice. There's uncertainty, right? It can be quite painful. It's much more pleasant to enter back into an illusion of that narcissistic relationship or any kind of addiction, by the way. Any kind of drug can bring one out of reality and bring them into another world. So being in reality is painfully difficult. Yes, I guess if one can begin to tolerate that in little bits and pieces, let's say, more and more, yeah, that would be a good way. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. I'm so excited today to welcome Lindsay, the stress nanny, to the podcast. In listening to her podcast, I was struck by how thoughtfully and compassionately she approaches the process of healing. In this episode, we're diving into some challenging but essential questions that circle around how to heal and rebuild emotional regulation after being in a narcissistic relationship. I'm so glad to have you here with us today, Lindsay. Welcome to the podcast. Hi.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I loved your work too, and I think this is going to be a really dynamic conversation.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get into it. So just to start, I wanted to ask you about something that really forms the foundation of the healing work. But first, maybe you can help us just set the stage for the listeners. When we talk about healing, what are we thinking about? What are we trying to heal? Maybe that's a good place for us to get started.
Yeah. So I love this graphic that Lindsay puts out, and it has an illustration of these big shapes. So when we're healing, it's if there's a square, there's one big shape that's taking up like most of the square. And it's like all of our energy, all of our thoughts, all of our efforts just have to go toward that big blob in this square. And like the things like our personal life and our health and our just education and other relationships, they all get crammed into this tiny little corner of the square, which the square is defined by our lives. And then the blob, the thing that's taking up the most space, that's the thing we're trying to heal from. And so for a time, it takes up a lot of space in our life to work through the process of healing. But the goal is that eventually it's just a small part of the square instead of the whole square. And then those other aspects of our lives, they come in and they can grow to their normal size again. So healing to me is like the process of working through a situation, an experience, a relationship that like has taken so much from us and has asked so much of us, and allowing it to become just a part of us instead of something that's just feeling so overwhelming to us.
I'm trying to imagine that image as you're describing it, and that sort of blob, right? That's taking up so much space. Is that like at the conscious level, or is it unconscious? Are people aware of what's in that blob, or what it's even all about?
That's such a good question. So I think that's just it, Anthony, right? Like initially it's like we're not aware of it, but it's like we're running into the like ramifications of it, right? And we see this like in relationships, right? Or in like different healing crisis experiences, things like that, where you just can't get away from it. And so it's like under the surface until you can't really get around it anymore, right? All of a sudden it's taking up so much space that we can't go anywhere, move through life without having an impact. And I feel like that's the point at which it begins to surface into the conscious, right? And we start to become aware of the impact of it. So like in a narcissistic relationship, for example, like we become aware and of all the different ways it's impacted us. And that's when we see that big blob taking up so much of the square. And we think, wow, it's not just this one little tiny piece of my life. It's actually created like so many other ramifications for me in my world. And so becoming conscious of it is like that point where we're illustrating the square and we've realized like, whoa, there's a lot to this. And then the healing process is the process of just like unearthing the other aspects of it or becoming fully aware of the ramifications of it so that we can then put it into a little bit more context or integrate.
Right. That's interesting. I like the word integrate also. We have to talk about that. But my perspective, as you may know, is always like psychodynamically oriented. So I may have a very different definition, and my listeners, they have a sense of how I think about a narcissistic relationship in terms of something that's referred to in the literature as the shared unconscious fantasy, which I won't go into right now. but maybe just again was just setting some foundation here. What is it in your mind? What does even a toxic or a narcissistic relationship look like? Like what's typically happening there?
In the like subconscious, are you saying, or in the
No,
conscious?
just like in reality, like the reality of just being in this relationship. What does it typically look like? I guess I'm just trying to describe, like,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, in like from a mindfulness standpoint, and in my own experience, it's like a relationship with a lot of imbalance, and there's very little reciprocity, and there's like a felt sense of a pull towards something that maybe you want to be moving away from.
and you're pulled to it. There's some sort of a lure that's pulling you in. In your theory or the way you conceptualize it, do you have a name for that? Like why people get so sucked into it? What's the pull?
It's probably what you just described in terms of that shared, like the shared
Okay.
undercurrent, but just the relational, like the history, the embeddedness in terms of just the past and the understanding of like how things work in the world. It's so deeply, especially in the parent-child relationship, right? There's so much embedded in like how you see the world, how you see yourself, that going away from that feels scary or uncertain or unknown. And so being like, it's not comfortable to be in the relationship, but the dynamics are what feels natural.
Oh, yeah. I think comforting is probably the right word because there is something, unfortunately, not in a healthy adaptive way, but there is something about it that is quite comfortable. You mentioned mindfulness just a moment ago, and that's your overall approach, right? So part of it is mindfulness, but I think self-compassion is part of mindfulness. Is that right? And if so, maybe you could talk a little bit about self-compassion and why it's such a key ingredient, right, to making changes in a relationship.
Yeah, is such a key part of a mindfulness practice because as we meditate or as we work through different breathing exercises, we're constantly getting distracted and our mind is getting pulled out of the focus on the breath or focus on the present. And we're thinking about dinner last night, or we're thinking about worrying about the relationship that we're thinking of or whatever. And so as part of a mindfulness practice, we have to practice that self-compassion to bring our focus back on the breath, right? Integral to our mindfulness practice is that self-compassion. In a relational setting, it's a similar thing, right? If you're trying to change relationship, it's not going to happen overnight. And it's definitely, we're not going to be able to cultivate the boundaries immediately that we need. We're going to, in each new situation, be figuring out how to like come at it with a little more integrity, how to be in a position of a little bit more autonomy. And so in those moments, we may make a mistake or look back and reflect and feel like, oh, I should have done it this way, or it could have been better. We might go back to the person, or we might like engage in a way that we know isn't healthy, but it's comfortable, right?
Yes.
And in those moments, we could beat ourselves up. And we can say, I'm never going to get it. This isn't never going to change. What's wrong with me?
So what's wrong with me is about what? Like, how is it that I ended up going back into that relationship that in some way I know is not good for me? Is that the what's wrong with me part?
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. And so in terms of self-compassion, like those thoughts aren't going to serve us, right? In the long run, we're not going to be served by beating ourselves up in those moments.
Right.
And so self-compassion comes in because we can do the same thing we do when we meditate. And we're like, oh, I got distracted. That was so human of me. Like, oh, like I was getting focused on something else. That's normal. I'm going to gently return to my focus on the breath. In those moments, I'm going to gently return to my idea of how I want this relationship to go. I'm going to gently return to the ideas about how I want to engage with this person or not engage, right? I'm going to gently treat myself as though like I am worthy of all the kindness and patience in the world. Engage again from that place instead of from like a place of beating ourselves up and being so harsh about maybe missteps that we regret.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like in the world of the psychodynamic perspective, we call it the punitive superego. It's like this inner voice that I guess maybe that's something I can ask. Like, where does this even come from? Some people probably would say it comes from the relationship, because if you're in a narcissistic or toxic relationship, part of that is there's the devaluation, right? It's not all blissful and idyllic, right? That there are of course, moments, many moments of where you're feeling completely diminished or devalued in some way. So I think some people would say it comes from the narcissistic partner. And I'm wondering if that's the way you see it. I know in my field, we like to think of history a little bit more and say that it's probably a little deeper than that. But I guess in just from the mindfulness perspective, like where is it coming from, or does it not really matter, I guess, as long as we're trying to be self-compassionate?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it maybe goes back to that, whether or not it matters, I think goes back to that idea of the square, right? And like how much this is impacting your experience. If you're running into this again and again, where you're devaluing yourself or you're having the tendency to just really be harsh, I think that's a point at which, like, from a mindfulness perspective, we can let it go all day long. But if it keeps coming, that's a sign that we need to dig a little deeper. And as you're suggesting, look at it from like a historical standpoint and try to understand why maybe this is tripping us up continually or why it's getting in the way of our growth. One of the tools that I love is the thought river. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
No, please tell us.
So the thought river is the idea that your brain is like a river of thoughts. So there's just like constantly down this river, there are all these different thoughts flowing. And we don't always know what's upstream from, like, the thought river is being populated by like our history, our experiences, all of those things. And so we, at any point in the day, might find ourselves like drowning in the river of our thoughts. And like, we're just like trying to come up for air and we're just getting whacked around by all these thoughts that are just floating down the river. At any point in time, we are able to stand up and walk to the side of the river and sit down on a rock and watch the thoughts go by. So in that moment, we become the observer of our thoughts instead of the victim of our thoughts. And so that's from a mindfulness standpoint, if we were sitting on the rock and that self-deprecation was coming down river a bunch, and we're like mindful of it and aware of it, we're like, I'm not going to act on that, but I am seeing it come down the river quite a bit. That's the point at which we would dive in a little deeper and say, like, where is that coming from? And from a mindfulness standpoint, we would look at relational, we would look at physical, we would look at historical, we would look at different facets of experience to understand better, like, why is this thought one that's repeatedly coming down river?
That's interesting. I could imagine when they're in it, it must be so hard to actually sit on the side of the river, because I could imagine somebody saying, if they're saying, oh, I'm not worthy of a better relationship, right?
Yeah.
That they can then find the proof that they're not worthy, right? Or I'm such a loser, or I'm a bad person. Then they find the proof of that. So I don't know if that's something you bump into, but people sometimes just become so convicted to the belief that they have a thought, and they think because they have a thought, it must be true. It's not just a thought or a feeling, it's a reality in that moment. And it's sometimes hard to shake that up or sit on the sideline, right? When it's coming and it's flooding you.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's so well put. When I look at it from the standpoint of self-compassion, circling back to that.
Yeah. Yes.
One of the things that I think is really powerful about the thought river is that when we can sit on the side of the river and observe our thoughts, just like you said, we may see that thought come down quite a bit. One of the beautiful things about this practice is that we can learn to ignore certain thoughts and focus our attention on the thoughts that are serving us and let the ones that aren't float by. So like when we see that self-deprecation, or I don't deserve this, or I'm not in a position to receive this, or we see that thought float by, we start to recognize it. And we start to be like, oh, there it is again. There it is again. There it is again. And while it doesn't maybe get easier to tolerate it, it does allow us to minimize or mute it a little bit so that maybe it's not quite as loud. So it's still uncomfortable, but not quite as like poignant in our minds. And when we can do that and see the patterning that we're working with in terms of our thoughts, what we start to notice is the other thoughts in the river. So like initially where it may be that like, I don't deserve this, I'm not good enough for this, comes down quite a bit. And that's all we're seeing. If we give it a minute and we wait, what we start to see is like, there's a chance that this could turn out differently. Or this person seems like they may have some skills that would be different than my ex. Or in this situation, I may have acted in a way that like shows some growth. right? There's other thoughts in there. It's just a matter of which ones we're paying attention to. And when we're trying to heal and when things feel really uncomfortable, those thoughts are so prominent, right, in our experience and in our consciousness. But when we can let them float down the river, we start to become aware of the other thoughts that are there. And when we can start to focus on and choose those thoughts and give them our attention, then it gets easier and easier to let the ones about us not being good enough float by.
I see. Yeah, I was going to actually ask you about how does one even begin to develop this self-compassion, but I think this is it, right? This is the beginning. If I could just pull out two words that you used as you were talking, which is let them. In other words, let them go by. And that's what I guess creates the space. And I don't know, is this the beginning of self-compassion, or does it look developing self-compassion, or does it look a little different than this?
I think this is a great place to start. And I want to point out too, and you alluded to it a moment ago, the initial process of minding our thoughts and just noticing what we're thinking, it's brutal because we have so many thoughts about ourselves that are not kind. And so initially we want to shy away and we don't want to see what's in the river because it's one thing after another about how we're not measuring up and not good enough. Yeah. And even more when we've been in relationships where that's been reinforced over and over again. Yeah. But if we can engage with it and trust that we have the resilience to let that initial phase of like self-deprecation move down the river, we will start to see the other thoughts. Or there's a compliment that a coworker gave us that might be in the river. Or there's a memory of a teacher who was really incredible and kind to us and believed in us even when we didn't believe in ourselves in the river. And so those thoughts start to come. And then when we can start to trust a little bit more the thoughts that are lifting us and encouraging us, that's like the shift where it starts to begin.
That's not easy because, again, what I often hear is, so a thought comes that somebody gave me a compliment. Yeah. Oh, but they were just being nice. Or, oh, they just needed to do that for whatever reason they can make up at that moment to negate the fact that there was a compliment, because letting something in that's of value like that becomes so difficult, so challenging for them.
Yeah. Do you find that's because of the dissonance between what they believe about themselves and what reality might be trying to suggest to them?
It's such a good question. When you're dealing with personality disorders, in part, it's because of what I mentioned a couple minutes ago, is they get so stuck in their way of thinking, especially if we're thinking of narcissism, because with the narcissist, if they think something, it must be true because they know everything. So then to question that, let's say they begin to accept that compliment, that's so different than the way they thought about it. But then what does that say about them? Because now they don't know everything. And if their whole structure is held together, their whole like psychic structure, their fragmented sense of self is held together by this false belief that they know everything, now it begins to crack sort of the foundation of what holds them together. And in part, that's what makes it so difficult to just accept something of value. And I'll just say one more thing. As I was saying that, one other thing came to my mind. It's also hard to accept those compliments because that could feel good and they could come to like that. So let's say you compliment me and I like that. I may start to depend on you in a way that I haven't before because I just dismissed what you were saying. It was irrelevant. And that's a big part of narcissism too, is they have an incredibly hard time depending on anybody because that means they're not self-sufficient, that they have a need. So these are just a few things that popped to my mind. And then I'll just say one more just quickly since you asked. Even on a deeper level, like a more disturbed level, is they have an addiction to the harmful, hurtful thoughts. Maybe for very different reasons, but maybe it's reminiscent of home. And this is the way they were spoken to at home. So that's hard to let go of because now you're not just asking them to accept a positive thought, but you're asking them to begin to separate from one of the only things that they knew, which was what? Home and the way they were spoken to. Yeah, I could see, just thinking out loud, it could get a little complicated. But please tell me, what are your thoughts even as you hear that? Does that make sense or does it sound too psychodynamic?
No, I love psychodynamic theory. I fell in love with psychology in high school in all kinds of stories along those lines. So I think there's so much beauty and value in it. I think from a mindfulness standpoint, part of it is, and this isn't something we've touched on and probably should, part of it is the ability to sit with that discomfort that you just described, right? Yeah. And to be able to sit with the various discomfort. And when we change anything, we feel that discomfort. And so I think there's a universality to it, right? Like when we're changing the way that we're engaging with the world, the way we're engaging with ourselves, while it looks different and the specifics of the situation are different, the discomfort, there's going to be a thread of similarity, right? And so when we can learn to trust our ability to sit in the discomfort, that's when it's powerful and we can make changes. And that's where like mindfulness, I define it as knowing what's going on inside of you, knowing what's going on outside of you, and making a choice on purpose. So in those moments, if we can notice those emotions, notice the thoughts, and trust that we can work through them, there's a power that can come. And sometimes we need support in order to do that. But there's a power that can come because the next time the discomfort comes up, we have a little bit more confidence in our ability to sit with discomfort in whatever way that looks like, and then make a choice, an informed choice about what to do with it instead of a reactive choice based on how we've always responded to that situation or that discomfort.
Let's take a quick break.
I get a lot of messages from listeners saying, Dr. Mazzella, I wish I could talk to you directly, but I also know that private therapy or one-on-one sessions aren't always possible or affordable. That's why I'm thinking about creating office hours, a low-cost, small group space where you can bring your questions about the podcast content, your confusion about narcissistic relationships, traits, and dynamics, and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's room for real conversation too. This space is designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If this speaks to you, head to drmazzella.com/office hours or just click on the link in the show notes to get notified when it launches. Okay, hope to see you there. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot because sitting with the discomfort implies sitting in reality, right? Because reality is uncomfortable. Not everybody's nice. There's uncertainty, right? It can be quite painful. It's much more pleasant to enter back into an illusion of that narcissistic relationship or any kind of addiction, by the way. Any kind of drug can bring one out of reality and bring them into another world. So being in reality is painfully difficult. Yes, I guess if one can begin to tolerate that in little bits and pieces, let's say, more and more, that would be a good way. I thought of one other question as I was listening to you, which is, so you have the discomfort, right? Whatever vice, it doesn't matter. Like we could say it's an addiction, it's a toxic relationship. What is part of the healing process then? You mentioned this word a little bit earlier, which I really appreciated, which was integration. And I don't know if you had any more to say about that. I like to hover over it just a little bit if you had any further thoughts about what integration even means or how it plays a role in the healing process.
Yeah, I love talking about integration, so I'd be happy to. One of the things that, and this is slightly personal, but one of the things that I recognized as I was navigating some healing stretches in my own life was that I wanted to keep the experience away from me. I didn't want to have it in the first place. And I didn't want it to be part of my story. Yeah. And for me, what the process of healing looked like, and mindfulness was a huge part of it, which is why I became an educator and coach people in this now. But one of the things that was like salient at that time was me trying to shove that piece of me away, was creating additional pain, was creating additional hurdles toward me feeling whole. And so whole being like, I could accept all the parts of myself and trust that they could be part of my eventual like vision for myself. So like, for example, I'll get a little more specific. So we navigated infertility. So I always wanted to have a big family, a lot of kids, and saw myself as a mom. And so it was the hardest thing in the world for me to come to terms with the fact that was not going to be the reality. And I had to align my view of myself with this new understanding of what my life was going to be. Yes. And for the longest time, I shoved it away. I didn't want to accept it. I didn't want to believe that was part of my story. And eventually, once I did, I was able to create a life that was incredible with that as a big part of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I just wonder, when you were shoving it away, were you continuing to pursue alternative methods or refusing to accept the infertility? What was happening? Yeah.
It's a great question. All of the above, right? At different phases. So at first, just, this can't be right. And I'm like avoiding it and just pretending it's not real. And then I'm eventually like, okay, I'm going to try to figure out how to work with this.
This is such a good learning point for the listeners.
Okay.
So when you shoved it away,
Yeah.
I can imagine people wondering, but why did that not work? Then you didn't have to deal with the painful reality, but you said it created more problems in your life. But I'm imagining if someone's really good at shoving something away, does it not just go away? Like, how does it continue to plague you?
It's such a good question. For me, I think that it was, again, in alignment with what I had a vision for of my life, like how I wanted my life to go. And we're not always at liberty to exactly decide how our life goes, obviously. But the things that were important to me, they kept like knocking on the door. These don't fit together, right?
Yeah.
So as much as I tried to keep it at bay, it was like I had to eventually face it because so many circumstances in my life invited it to me.
Oh, so it doesn't go away. It never really goes away. Even though you could push it away, we use another concept called split off. Like you could split off, you could do whatever. Oh, it reminds me, I won't go down this rabbit hole, but there's a TV show that's out now called Severance. I don't know if you heard of it.
Yeah.
So it's about it's really well done in terms of the psychology behind it, if you like analyzing TV shows. But it's all about a split personality between life and work, right? They call them the innies and the outies. Like you're out of life and you're in a life. So in a way, that's what you're getting at. If you push it away, because all the people who, if you watched it, and I won't go too far in case people haven't watched it yet, but something painful in reality happened to them. Maybe there was a death, something, and they decided to engage in this process of, they call it severance, but we call it splitting in my field. But to your point, it's very subtle in the show, but what we come to realize is they can never split off and get rid of that part of their life, even though they did like whatever to their brain to get rid of those memories. In little bits and pieces, it intrudes into their innie world where they're supposed to be safe from that trauma, because it really was a trauma. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's such a great example. And that's where I think the choice becomes, right? You either keep trying to avoid, or there's a spectrum of choices, but on either end of the spectrum is like extreme avoidance or integration.
Yes.
And so if we can find ourselves moving toward integration and toward that kind of like gentle acceptance of ourselves, of the situation, of whatever circumstance or relationship we're in, of our own tendencies, when we can accept it, then we move toward integration because we can learn to work with it. So instead of fighting it, we work with it. And as we work with it, we cultivate the tools, the resilience, and like the stamina necessary, the self-compassion, right? All these skills, those skills we accumulate moment by moment as we engage with the challenging circumstance, person, situation.
I want to go to one more thing. We wrap things up. But mindfulness is, I'm always so curious about it because there's another concept that I use called containment. And containment is a therapeutic technique that's often used, I don't want to say in the beginning phases of a treatment, because it depends on the level of regression. It depends on where the patient is developmentally, how much capacity they have for reflection. Are they coming in a dysregulated state of mind? But I guess what I'm wondering, this is going to be really hard because it's probably a whole theory on just mindfulness, I would imagine. But what does it actually look like in terms of the healing process? What is mindfulness?
Yeah. So I think it is at its core, and you're right, we could have a very long and involved conversation about this. But I think at its core, it is just that ability to be present with whatever you're experiencing. So like in the healing journey, there are going to be a variety of situations or moments or setbacks or things where we have to just sit in what is and not fight it. And if we cannot fight it, and if we can be self-compassionate, we can usually find our way through it and move toward integration. But if we fight it, we're fighting the present moment. Like you said, we're fighting reality, right? Yeah. And fighting reality is just like using energy for purposes. Yes. Not a great use of energy. So it's the acceptance, both of the moment and of ourselves, is the power of mindfulness. Because in the present moment, that's where we have access to the insights we've received from teachers or therapists or just our internal wisdom. We have access to historical accounts or remembrances of maybe why we are in the situation that we're in. but we also have access when we're not fighting it to our creativity. And that's one of the houses of mindfulness, is the ability to respond creatively in any given situation. Because if our nervous system is activated, we're beating ourselves up and we're just like in a tizzy, that's not a technical word, but if we're completely, then it's so hard for us to access the creativity and adaptability that we need to be flexible in those moments.
Yeah, I used the word reflectiveness earlier, but that's creativity. That's having a capacity for symbolization, for thinking about things more deeply. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like when we can combine a lot of those mindful moments, we start to respond from a place of intention instead of reactivity. And the more we respond with intention, the more we move closer to that idea of integration. And the closer we align with the vision we have for how we would like something to go, how we would like to see ourselves, even if it feels like a kind of a dream to see ourselves in that way. But those mindful minutes stacked together, those small intentional actions, that's those regular practices of self-compassion. It sounds so simple, but it adds up over time and becomes like a life view and the way we see the world and the way we respond to circumstances more than our conditional patterning.
No, I mean, it doesn't sound simple at all, because like I mentioned earlier, if there's like an addiction to chaos or intensity, right, it's going to be really hard to give that up. And I like the way you broke down mindfulness, like the core feature is in the moment, right? Because then that sort of pulls some things together that you mentioned a little bit earlier, like sitting by the river. Instead of being in the river of thoughts coming down, you're sitting by the river. So again, you're just in the moment, right? Or to go to something else, you said being with that discomfort, that as painful as it is, and then beginning over time to slowly recognize that you can tolerate a moment of discomfort, that it's not as catastrophic as you had imagined it would be. So being in the moment sounds really valuable.
Well, I'm glad.
So anything else you want to mention, or anything else that you feel would be of value to the listeners before we sign off?
I think one story that would be, or metaphor that would be helpful to share, is the idea of emotions as benches. I don't know if you've heard this. It's the work of Becky Kennedy. So if you imagine, I like to imagine Central Park. So there's so many different benches in Central Park, right? And there's some benches that are in a shady area, some benches where you're watching people go by and it's really active and bright and sunny, by the bridge, by the Harlem Mirror. There's just benches everywhere. If we can think of emotion with the same level of acceptance as we're trying to foster toward ourselves and the present moment, and we can just accept the emotions that come, we can think of them like all those different benches in Central Park. So if our goal is to be able to sit on every bench in Central Park, our goal is to be able to feel and sit with any emotion that comes up for us, because we're humans. All emotions are normal. What we do with them is our choice when we're mindful. The metaphor speaks to me because I think that sometimes we shy away from certain emotions, which makes them even more uncomfortable. In this moment where we're trying to tolerate discomfort, we might be like having a moral judgment about the feeling that we're having, if it's anger or something. And so if we can just be a little more neutral, be like, the emotions are like the benches in Central Park. We're probably going to sit on a whole bunch of those benches throughout our lives, right? And the goal is to be able to manage to sit on whatever bench we find ourselves with that same level of acceptance and self-compassion. I think that's another piece of it, because when we can sit with self-compassion for the moment, ourselves, and the thing that we're feeling, that's when we, like we're saying, can access the creativity, the flexibility, the responsiveness to the situation and act with intention more than a conditioned reactivity, either to the moment, to the person, or to the feeling of emotion.
I love the metaphor on a number of levels, one of which is I live on the Upper East Side, and I love Central Park. So any metaphor that has Central Park, I appreciate it. And two, I think, again, it brought something else together. As I was listening, I imagined, I don't like the benches on the north side of the park. I only like the south side of the park. But there's the splitting again, right? There's the lack of integration. And it's to be a whole park goer, to get the full experience of life, which is life in the park, you need integration. In other words, you need to at least be flexible enough to experiment with sitting on the north side benches as you would on the south side, or you're really missing out on something. Anyway, Lindsay, the Stress Nanny, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Everybody, Lindsay has her own podcast, The Stress Nanny, which I recommend that you check out. It's very valuable.
Yeah.
Check out her channel. Thanks again, Lindsay.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. Okay, everybody. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.